Welcome here. We can say, can't imagine this is something to rejoice in, but it's due to the continuing spread of the virus at Sera that I've been able to come tonight. I was speaking to Shanti. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to attend the session because they were talking about starting the schedule again. And actually this morning at 8 a.m., they announced that we were going to have debate this evening. And then at 9 a.m., they announced that everything's canceled. So apparently there's actually 12 new cases now at Sera. So it's quite a difficult situation here. We've been shut down for 5 months. So yeah, I don't know what will happen. But in any case, I think this will be our last session for the time being because we were supposed to have exams next month and I need to prepare for that. Again, that does depend on the situation here, but assuming that the exams do happen, I'll prepare. And then after the exams in November, maybe I could think about doing more of these sessions or even another course, depending on the time. But with that said, maybe if people have particular questions, please feel free to ask. Oh, I think you're on mute, Paul, if you're speaking.
Okay. Yeah, if nobody has any questions in particular, I received the reply.
Right.
You put some notes,
Yeah.
but maybe so other people have questions, and by all means, let them go first. But yeah, I've had a look at what you've written. I'm a little bit at capacity at the moment here, so I didn't have a look until last night. But yeah, I've had 2 or 3 hours to go over and have a look at what you've written. So happy to discuss that.
Okay.
Whenever you are. Really.
Yeah, if you have a particular thing, let me know.
Yeah. Okay.
There's something about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I've made some notes.
You want me to share that document or just comment on it?
Is that's for Venerable, yeah? The question.
Oh, yeah. Sure. You can share it if you like. It would help.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few comments you've put, and I've got a reply to, and then at the bottom, you've suggested that the other topics that you might consider discussing would be equivalent in terms of establishment and abiding, one entity that is equivalent in terms of establishment and abiding, and one entity that is equivalent in terms of establishment and abiding with respect to the place.
Oh yeah, at the very end of it.
Yeah. But just to remind you,
maybe Shanti, just scroll on to the very end of the document. I think it was the last thing. Yeah, here. Okay, yeah. Okay. So yeah, just the question was, because you're making a chart of one, one entity, one nature, one substance, all these. So relevant subjects there are these other ones that come up. I mean, I guess you're studying the collected topics, so it's in the 5th section, I believe, in the section on cause and effect. They talk about these other equivalent in terms of establishment and abiding is like is two things that that are born together, abide together, and disintegrate together, but they're not necessarily one substantial entity. So, for example, I think what's given there is the smell of sandalwood and the color of sandalwood, or something like that.
Yeah. So same in establishment and abiding.
Right.
Let's say they rise together, abide together, and cease together, but they are not same substance. Although they do appear to a direct perceiver, they appear separately.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's right. So that's one, and then one entity that is equivalent in terms of establishment and abiding. So it's not only that it's the mix of both of them. They can be, one like the color of sandalwood and the smell of sandalwood are equivalent in terms of establishing and abiding, but not one entity. Whereas the pot and an impermanent thing are one entity, but not equivalent in terms of establishment and abiding. Whereas, a pot and the handle of a pot are both. There is one entity in terms of establishment. They're one entity, and they're also equivalent in terms of establishment and abiding.
Okay,
and then
so
finally, just finally, this last part, there's even more close relationship where you have one entity that is equivalent in terms of establishment and abiding from any perspective, place, time, and nature. So this would be like a pot and the impermanence of pot. So what that means is that place here means wherever there's the pot, there's the impermanence of pot. Wherever time there is, whenever pot exists, the impermanence of pot exists, and whatever nature there is. So what that means, for example, you have I said the handle of a pot, or the spout of a pot, you could say. The spout of a pot is not equivalent from the perspective of place with a pot, because wherever the pot is, the spout is not necessarily there. The pot is the base. The base is still part of the pot, but the spout is not there. So they're not equivalent in terms of the place. They are equivalent in terms of time, because they're one entity. Whenever the pot exists, the spout also exists. But they're also not equivalent in terms of nature, because that would imply that any kind of pot has a spout, but you can also have a pot without a spout. So, but the impermanence of pot, wherever there's pot, there's impermanence of pot. Any kind of pot has impermanence.
Okay. So may I? I've
got both gross impermanence and subtle impermanence.
Well, mainly it's talking about subtle impermanence, because subtle impermanence, when we say the word impermanence, the self-isolate of impermanence usually means subtle impermanence. The gross impermanence is simply the breaking of the pot. So Paul, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so I was having a look through my notes this morning. I think we've probably been debating the small topics here for probably 4 years now. And we go round and there's a lot of stuff that Geshe Graham teaches, and I can't remember everything. Sometimes I get mixed up what was in the small topics and what's not, and I've got to admit I couldn't remember this being in the small topics, but I was having a look at some notes that I had, and this was in terms of what I have is one in establishment and abiding.
Right.
So those that are established simultaneously, abide simultaneously, and disintegrate simultaneously.
Exactly, right.
And I would put that as something like pot and the impermanence of pot. And establishing, my understanding in this context is that established refers to it being an established base, and although it's an impermanent phenomena, that it is an established base. And abiding, or sometimes we have a translation as lasting, refers
Okay.
to a phenomenon maintaining a continuum of being the same type.
Right.
That's my understanding of establishing and abiding. So
Right.
established simultaneously, so part and the impermanence of part to establish, come into existence simultaneously.
Yeah. Established means born or generated,
Okay.
right? Right. So yeah, they whenever pot starts, the first moment of pot, there has to be the impermanence of pot.
Yeah, so they abide and disintegrate simultaneously.
Right.
Okay.
So as long as pot exists, the impermanence of pot exists.
Yeah.
And if pot no longer exists, then the impermanence of pot no longer exists.
Yes. Yeah. And so I put, things like the taste of chocolate bar, the taste of the chocolate bar, and the shape of the chocolate bar, for instance.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And then you get somebody saying, well, actually, if you've consumed the chocolate bar, you've eaten it.
Yeah.
You can't see the chocolate bar anymore, but you can taste it. So,
Yeah, that's a good
taste
question.
of the chocolate bar still exists.
Yeah. Like, for example, the example we have in the text of the color of sandalwood and the scent of sandalwood. People would argue, well, look, you burn the sandalwood, but you can still smell it. It still lingers in the air.
Yes.
So isn't this scent, last longer than the color?
Yeah.
But I think most people answer, well, when the sandalwood is gone, that scent is no longer the scent of sandalwood, because there has to be the base of sandalwood. So it's the scent of the smoke that comes from sandalwood, but it's not actually the sandalwood scent. But so you could say you've eaten the chocolate bar, you have the aftertaste in your mouth, but it's no longer the taste of the chocolate bar because the chocolate bar no longer exists. But these are definitely points we debate. These are interesting questions.
Yeah, I have to say that actually I'd always held the position that, the odor of the sandalwood, let's say in my room, I'm burning an incense stick.
Right.
The incense stick ceased at kind of lunchtime, but I come back into my room at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there's the odor of the sandalwood, of the incense stick.
Yeah.
But and we've debated that for a couple of years, and then going back over this last night, I thought, well, actually, can the odor of the sandalwood exist if the sandalwood doesn't exist? And I don't think it can.
Right. That seems to be the position that we have in our textbook. But yeah, it's a question, because what does it mean to be the odor of sandalwood? Certainly, colloquially, we use that. We say that it still smells like sandalwood in here.
Yeah.
But it's in this system, it seems to be saying that. I mean, if you really look at what they're saying, because they say the odor of sandalwood and the color of sandalwood are substantially different, but that's also an interesting point, because I'm not sure in modern scientific understanding of perception whether they would talk about it that way. Is the odor of sandalwood really something different than the sandalwood itself? Whereas in this system, they have a conception that every atom, every particle has 8 parts, and those are substantially different from each other. So it's like if you actually break down the sandalwood, you'll find little odor particles and little color particles that are different things.
Okay. So, okay, good. Then I had one substantial entity in establishment and abiding.
Right.
So my first one is one in establishment and abiding. Now one substantial entity in establishment and abiding.
Right.
And phenomena that are the same substantial entity in terms of establishment and abiding. And so then I had something like, again, pot and the impermanence of pot, pot and the shape of pot, or fire and hot and burning. And in brief, I thought there was 3 possibilities between one substantial entity in establishment and abiding, and one in establishment and abiding.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we have these 3 things here. So you have one establishment abiding. That's exactly what I'm talking about for one. I just, however I translated it is different. But
is that
and then when you say one substantial entity, yeah, these were just my, just think off the top of my head. So I don't know how it's usually translated, but so the second one substantial entity. That's what I mean. So yeah, I would say that these three are sort of build on each other. So whatever is two here is necessarily one. Oh, sorry, whatever. Yeah, that's right. Whatever is two here is necessarily one, and whatever is three here is necessarily one and two, but not the other way around. Something can be one and not two and three, and something can be one and two, but not three.
Okay. So I had as an example of something, if there is one substantial entity in establishment and abiding, it is one in establishment and abiding, but it's not the case if there's one in establishment and abiding, that it's one substantial entity in establishment and abiding. And I put down the taste of chocolate bar and the shape of the chocolate bar.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be a good example.
Okay. Now the third point, I have one in establishment and one substantial entity of establishment, abiding, and disintegration. And my translation, and I think I might have this wrong, and Geshe Graham's corrected me, and I just can't remember everything, I'm afraid. One substantial entity of establishment and abiding and disintegration in relation to object, time, and nature. But is it actually place, time, and nature? Or is it object?
I think I'm sorry. I don't mean to contradict Geshe Graham. I hope I'm not.
You might not be. He's told me the right answer, and I can't remember.
I think object is a wrong translation.
Okay.
Because we actually debate this in Tibetan, and the word in Tibetan yul, it can mean object. It can also mean place.
Okay.
And some people consider it to mean object, but I don't think that's correct. Okay. I think in this context it means place, because it's not talking about. Some people think that it means, for example, if pot is the object of consciousness, then the pot's impermanence is also the object in terms of the appearing object.
Yes.
But that's not what it's talking about. If you look in Dharmakirti's text, when he's talking about these things, he's saying, for example, the west and east side of a pot. So it's a place in the sense of spatial place, not object of consciousness.
Okay, so here's where I definitely have an issue, because my first point, so it should be place. How do we understand what that means? I've got the awareness that takes one phenomenon as its appearing object, and an awareness that takes another phenomenon as its appearing object are equivalent. So let's say, pot and the impermanence of pot, they appear to the same direct perceiver, let's say the eye consciousness apprehending pot, then pot and the impermanence of pot appear to that same direct perceiver. But you're saying that's not maybe the correct understanding.
Right, I don't think that's what it's talking about.
Could you just explain again, sorry, what it actually means?
So I think it's talking about spatial dimensions.
Spatial dimensions.
Right. So if you look at pot, any part of pot is pervaded by the impermanence of pot. The west side of the pot, the east side of the pot. I mean, with the right side, left side, top, bottom. They are all, the impermanence of pot is sort of spread throughout all of them.
Yes.
Whereas something like the spout of a pot is one nature with the pot because it's a part of the pot, but it's not necessarily one place. That it's not the bottom part of the pot, the spout doesn't exist there. I mean, you could also talk about it like you say in terms of the appearing object, that the pot appears to your consciousness, but the spout does not. But I'm saying I don't think that's because this threefold group, place, time, and nature, this is something Dharmakirti talks about.
Okay.
And we say mixing, like we have a meaning generality, then place, time, and nature are mixed.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not talking about appearing objects, it's talking about place. So for example, when you think about a pot, the west and the east side appear as one. It here appears as a singularity. I mean, it's not that you literally have an appearance to your mind of like the west and the east is one thing, but you conceive of it that way, that you say, I'm touching the pot. You don't say, I'm touching the east side or the west. I mean, you could say that, but the point is when you say I'm touching the pot, you have a sense of it as a single thing that encompasses all of those different places, those parts.
Yes.
So spatial parts, temporal parts, right? You think of a pot, you don't think I'm touching the second moment of the pot. You just think I'm touching the pot. And also nature, that when you think of touching a pot, I mean, if you think of touching a wooden pot, that's a different question. But if you say I'm touching a pot, it mixes a wooden pot, a plastic pot, a metal pot, all these different things. And then you can get more specific, but it's in terms of what you're thinking. But when you just have the conception of pot, it's a general thing of all of those different ones.
Okay. So in terms of place, we're talking about location.
Or even like spatial, like
spatial dimensions.
like so the east side of the pot, the west side of the pot. So it's like locality, maybe a good term.
Okay.
Location, like locality,
So what do we say? Okay, so I don't quite get it. So we've got the east side of the pot and the west side, or the top of the pot and the bottom of the pot.
So for example, the main idea in Dharmakirti's work is that when something appears to direct perception, place, time, and nature are not mixed. And when it appears to conceptual consciousness, they are mixed.
Yeah.
So when you see a pot with your eyes, the west and the east side do not appear as a singularity. You think of a pot, you group it all into one thing. Yes. So you have, this is how part of the way say the conception of permanence, that I have an idea of Paul and I think I'm seeing the same person I saw last week, but actually to my eye consciousness, it's totally different. Different things are appearing to my eye consciousness than appeared last week. It's my conceptual consciousness that is grouping them as a singularity.
Sure.
And likewise, if I see your head and I see your feet, I still say I see Paul. But to my eyes, something totally different is appearing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, so that's place. The first point is place. Time, that seems fairly straightforward. Time of establishment of one phenomena and the time of establishment of the other phenomena equivalent. So we have pot and the impermanence of pot. Established, abide, and cease simultaneously. And then the third part of being nature, I have being one substantial entity, one phenomena, being one substantial entity with the other phenomena equivalent. So I've got the example of, what did I put here? So pot and impermanence of pot. If it's a phenomenon, it's same substantial entity with the impermanence of pot, it's necessarily the same substantial entity with pot. If it's same phenomenon, same substantial entity with pot, it's necessarily same substantial entity with the impermanence of pot.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's one of the. That's when we say two things are one substantial entity in terms of place, time, and nature. Then one of the criteria for that is that anything that's one nature with one of them has to be the same with the other.
Yeah, okay.
So that's like what you just said. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm good with that.
But that's a criteria for it.
Okay. Okay, so that's good. Thank you for that. It's the first one's a little unclear.
The place.
Yeah. I need to listen back to what you've said and have a think about that.
Okay.
So I'll hand over to somebody else.
So Venerable, I was wondering, is it just that Mula Madhyami Karika by Nagarjuna can be interpreted both the context of a Swatantrika Madhyamika or Prasangika Madhyamika, depending on how you interpret it, or these other texts, these other more different style texts. Can all of them be
text you mean? Oh,
like
all of the
60
Nagarjuna
standard
texts.
Nagarjuna?
Yeah, of course, because we say there's the Chung Chimo, which means the I think Hopkins translates it as the fundamental Madhyamaka texts, right? So those are any text by Nagarjuna and any text by Arya Deva. What that means is that all Madhyamakas consider those authoritative. And so then they all interpret them different ways. So Bhavaviveka, he considers anything by Nagarjuna or Arya Deva as a authoritative Madhyamaka text, and he interprets it in his way. And Chandrakirti does the same. I mean, they mainly, like, for example, Bhavaviveka, he only wrote a commentary on the root wisdom. He didn't, the Madhyamaka Kardika, he didn't write a commentary on the others, but he obviously would have known about them. And so he would have considered them to have been, you know, from his perspective, the way he interpreted them.
And is there something new? I mean, is there something different in Ratnavali with respect to wisdom of emptiness that is not there in Mula Madhyamika, or something that explained more in detail, or there's some repetition in that?
I think there's probably some repetition. I think it's understood that he composed that text first. So I think that was the first of the six. So it would be, you could say that it was sort of a more, that he had a more, how do you say? You know, if you want to think of his view as developing, it was sort of a more base, you know, more, you know, the first stages of his coming together with his philosophy, and then it became more highly developed later. So it's sort of the roots of what he later came to compose in Root Wisdom. You know, there are definitely some points that are more clear in Ratnavali, and also it's a lot more poetic. So a lot of the ways it's said are perhaps more accessible. Like, for example, the stanza in the first chapter that His Holiness often quotes, that the person is not earth, nor water, nor wind, nor space, nor consciousness, right? So that's essentially saying a very similar thing to what, if you look at the first stanza of the 22nd chapter of the Root Wisdom, when he talks about the Tathagata is not one with his aggregates or different, right? But it's saying it in a different way. For one thing, rather than talking about the 5 aggregates, it uses the 6 constituents, which is just another way of describing the person. But it could be useful for meditation. You know, so that it's a much more poetic text, whereas Root Wisdom is very technical.
Sean, go ahead. You can ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hey, Venerable. It's really nice to finally join one of these. Sorry, I'm a bit late. I'm still figuring out the time zone.
Right, it's okay.
Right. So I did have a more direct question, but a question came up in my mind yesterday that's kind of semi-related. In the Pali Canon, it's taught that the Eightfold Path is like a raft, and that you use it to cross the river. And once you've crossed the river, you no longer need the Eightfold Path because you've reached your destination. So it's the distinction between the means and the goal.
Right.
So I wanted to know how, with emptiness and practicing emptiness, this well, I don't want to say obviously, but to me, you know, it falls under right view, the majority of it. And so there's 3 characteristics that I have three stories that I want to know where they kind of resemble, whether it's the means or the goal. And so on a scale, I guess, from less harsh to most harsh. One example is there's a anecdote of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and a monk had come to him after retreat, and this monk was, I guess, just in complete distress, and maybe he was a bit mad at Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche just ended up laughing at him, at his face, this monk that was in distress, and so, long story short, the intention behind that was, of course, Lama Zopa Rinpoche was celebrating that he was letting the dirt out, as he said.
Right. Okay.
A medium reference in terms of harshness, I guess, just in terms of how we would interact on a normal social interaction, and how sometimes Buddhism can seem a bit abstract to those that don't practice. I remember, and I tried to find the source of this, and I couldn't, but so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember a reading about in the higher realms, the gods will kind of laugh at us during our misfortune. Even so, maybe during death, if somebody has an accidental death or just a normal death, or there's distress around death. And the only way I could kind of scale this in terms of relatability is kind of like how maybe we watch in America, we'll watch like America's Funniest Videos, or something funny on YouTube where somebody will step on a shovel and they hit themselves. And obviously that person is in pain, but we know kind of intellectually that that person's okay. So we're allowed to laugh at it. And then the third example, there's that, the text I got from 84,000 translations, Manjushri's play, which at first, because I think being a Westerner, for some reason, I thought it was going to be related to a playwright, but it's actually Manjushri's play, as in he's going around and kind of being mischievous with teaching enlightenment. And he eventually, he encounters this female, and she becomes a bodhisattva. And now that character then leads a soldier of a kingdom to the forest. She seduces him, and in the middle of intercourse, she turns into a corpse to teach him impermanence and how worldly pleasures, all that. So I just wanted to know these three things. Obviously, there's lessons of emptiness in there, but if any normal person in Western society reacted like that in any social situation, it would be quite who's seen as mean, or right. So that's my question. I don't know. I won't conclude anymore, but I just want to know where those. Does all that come with the goal, or does some of that come with practicing, or is it a culmination of the two?
Okay. So there's a few different questions you're asking here, right? It's actually quite complex. So the first one is about the raft and the shore, right? About the Noble Eightfold Path being like a raft. And then there's basically the question of using skillful means. This is what you're talking about in the second one, about people using almost, what could be a harmful action, but in a way to teach somebody, right? And then how that, you're asking, do they relate? Because it has to do with the goal. When you reach the goal, you no longer have to maybe follow the Eightfold Path of all of the, for example, you don't have to follow right morality is the question, because you're now enlightened. So these are very big questions that different in Buddhism, that different schools interpret in different ways, right? So you have the raft and the shore. You also have, it's similar even in the Madhyamaka text, the Mahayana text, the Mahayana Sutra Lamkara by Maitreya, the ornament for the Mahayana Sutras. He has the passage that the teachings are like a boat, and then so you abandon them when you reach the other side. So then some people interpret that does the Buddha no longer have path consciousness, or what is the Buddha's mind like? This is a big question. And so definitely some people interpret it that the Buddha does not even have consciousness, that Buddha is like it's like a reflection, that due to the Buddha's merit, we see this appearance of a person and hear the teachings, which are only appearances to our mind. But from the Buddha's side, there's nothing there. And a lot of the Indian texts, if you look at what they're literally saying, it almost seems like they're saying that. So, some schools, especially pre-Tsongkhapa, but also I think in some of the Nyingma Sakya, there are people who interpret it that way. Whereas Tsongkhapa, this is one of the main unique things of the system, is a very different approach, where he says very clearly, the Buddha has consciousness, all of these things. The Buddha has compassion. It's not like there's just nothing there. You don't take that literally, but it's sort of that it's the way that the way the Buddha's mind functions is so far beyond a normal conception that it's almost like saying it's not there. So, in Tsongkhapa's system, the Buddha still has the Noble Eightfold Path. But again, some of the other systems have different questions about that. And also, in terms of Noble Eightfold Path, which is generally classed in terms of the Hinayana class of practice, so it's very common in the Pali Canon, that then there's a question of what is an arhat. And certainly in a lot of the Hinayana schools, like in the Theravada, I believe, they have generally the understanding that when somebody achieves arhatship, then when they die, the consciousness ceases. And so they consider the Noble Eightfold Path to be the meaning of, we have the three, what's it called? The three doors of liberation, you may have heard of: emptiness, signlessness, and wishlessness, right? So in their system, wishlessness, it classifies the path itself, meaning that that it's something to be abandoned. When you achieve arhatship, the path disappears. The only thing that stays is the truth of cessation, but the consciousness ceases. So it's something that you use to get to liberation, but once you get there, it itself becomes a burden. So it's not something you wish for. It's wishless. That's their understanding of wishlessness. So there's all different ideas of how these function and what does it mean to be, the raft on the shore. But then also there's this question, as you say, of it's related. It's not exactly the same question, but it's related of when somebody has higher realizations, can they break the rules? Can they go beyond these things? And that definitely Tsongkhapa would agree with that. Everyone agrees with that pretty much, that when somebody reaches very high stages of realization, a lot of these rules can actually be restrictive. I mean, we see that also just in terms of the classification of the pratimoksha, the individual liberation vows, versus the bodhisattva vows and the tantric vows. And a lot of them contradict each other. There are things that you're encouraged to do in the bodhisattva vows that would contradict the individual liberation vows. So just for like mild things that wouldn't seem to be harmful necessarily, we see. I've been reading this Big Love, the story of Lama Yeshe. Some of you have probably been reading or have read this at this point. And we can see that, knowing as a monk, because maybe lay people reading it don't know, Lama Yeshe, to ordinary appearances, we might say, broke a lot of monastic rules. But actually, Lama Yeshe was not just foolish. He also knew the bodhisattva vows very well. And I would say he was actually keeping the bodhisattva vows very well, because there's a lot of times when it says, if it's very clear. It's not like you just become completely liberal in your behavior or just dismiss the individual liberation vows, but there are certain contexts where you should break them if it's a restriction to being of benefit to others. So, for example, a monk is not meant to sit alone in a room with a woman, and there's good reason for that, because it's likely that someone could generate desire. And also that other people will wonder what's going on. That monk is behind that closed door with that woman. But Lama Yeshe many times had female students in his room, and it was very beneficial for them. So, it was more beneficial to do that, especially because he had, it would seem, controlled over his desire, so it wasn't going to be an issue in terms of him. But we have to be very careful with that, because then somebody could look at that and say, well, that's how Lama Yeshe behaved, or they could say, well, that's what it says to do in the Bodhisattva vows. That's why, in some sense, we have to study them very closely, because we have to look at what exactly is it saying is the exception here. It has to have a lot of factors present, and it's, if it was, for example, there's another, actually, just in that same book that talks about how when they were in, I think Thailand, or not Thailand, but some other country, maybe I think it's Indonesia, but a country where they're more, the cultural bias is stronger in terms of the individual liberation vows, then Lama Yeshe was very careful, because he knew that in that country, if he was walking alone with a woman, which a monk is not supposed to do, people would have a very negative view of that. So, that's one thing. If it's going to cause more disturbances to people's minds than benefit, then you shouldn't. It's actually against the Bodhisattva vows to do that, because it's going to harm others. And also, for oneself, if it's going to cause you to generate desire and lose track of your mind, then you shouldn't do it. So you have to be very careful about what to do in those cases. And that increases, of course, with the tantric vows. So with the tantric vows, one of the main questions is about sexual desire, that in Tantra, it's understood that one can use sexual desire in the path. And so there's a very big question. Does that mean that if a monk can use sexual desire in the path, that he can go and do so? And so actually different schools had different interpretations, but Tsongkhapa in his interpretation is very, very clear that no, a monk cannot have sexual intercourse as a tantric practice. If there's two options, one is you don't do that, or two, you give back your monastic vows and do that. But it's even if it would be that the monk, through using sexual intercourse, could become enlightened, you can't do that. And that's actually what Tsongkhapa himself had set that example. You might have read in Tsongkhapa's life story that it says that at a certain point, he recognized that if he practiced with the consort, he would become enlightened in this life. And he chose not to do so, because he thought even his becoming enlightened would be less beneficial than his establishing a pure monastic lineage. And if he set the example of giving back his monastic vows, then it would be very harmful in the future. So it's like there are certainly cases where somebody can break the rules, but it's not that they just do it haphazardly. It has to be done very mindfully. It's that the person is so advanced that they're aware of all of the consequences of what could happen. We have the example of the Buddha's past life, you may have heard of in the Jataka tales, where in one lifetime it said that he was a captain of a ship, and he knew that one of the people in the ship intended to kill actually everybody on the ship, so kill 500 people. And so there's two things here. He went and killed this person, but it said, first of all, it wasn't just for compassion for the people that were going to be killed, it was more for the compassion for the person killing. So it has to be because he recognized the person doing this action was going to suffer so much as a result of that. So it has to be done really out of compassion for everybody involved. And then secondly, there's a question, did he suffer as a result of that? So some interpretations are that yes, because although he had the proper motivation of doing it, the actual motivation at the time of killing is the intention to kill somebody. So there has to be some result of suffering. So somebody has to be willing to experience that. But then there are other interpretations that because he had such a pure motivation of compassion, there was no non-virtue created, there was no suffering as a result. But again, these of course become important questions in life. These things happen all the time. Most of us aren't in situations where we're going to kill somebody out of compassion, but it's always a question of, how strict should you be versus, as I said at the beginning, skillful means. Is it skillful in order to help a particular person? So within Tibetan Buddhism, generally speaking, it's not 100%, but generally speaking, the Gelug is much more conservative. like I said, Tsongkhapa's interpretation of the tantric vows, but also in general of just how teachers behave. They tend to be much more conservative, whereas, for example, in the Kagyu system, there's a lot more, we see manifestations of teachers using unconventional means. And this has become a major issue in America for sure. I mean, you know about Chogyam Trungpa, who was one of the most unconventional teachers, and is still a big question. People ask, was it proper what he did? And then is that, so if we say that it was, does that authorize everyone else to behave that way? Because, for example, his son has been behaving the same way, it seems, and now he's been expelled from the Shambhala organization. So it's a big question. In the modern world, do we say, well, he's a bodhisattva, so we don't take him to court? I don't know. So these are very useful questions to ask, actually. Not first of all because they're relevant in these major issues in Buddhism in the West, but also in terms of our own practice. We can't always keep every vow perfectly, but we also have to be very careful to do. We don't want to just say, "Well, I'm just being skillful. I can do this, this, that, or this other thing." Really, the most important thing of all is, we say, mindfulness and awareness. Being very aware of what you're doing and why, and not deceiving yourself and thinking, "Oh, I'm just doing this because it's skillful," when it's their motivation. If awareness means awareness of one's mind, so you have to know when actually your motivation is anger or desire, when it seems like, "Oh, I think I'm just doing this to be helpful." So hey, this is a long answer to your question. It doesn't even begin to touch it because these are very deep issues.
Thank you, though. It helps.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? Shubhangi, do you have any question?
Venerable, I have been using this book by Serme Khensur Lobsang Tharchin for 6-session Guru Yoga.
Yeah. Good.
This book. Now.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So in this book, in the beginning, they have asked us to visualize Guru Shakyamuni Buddha and then Guru Vajradhara. And then in front of them, they have asked us to visualize 4 rows of tantric deities and then Sutrayana Buddhas and then Bodhisattvas.
Right.
So I find it slightly strange that Sutrayana Buddhas should, they are amongst the worshippers of Guru Shakyamuni Buddha and also Guru Vajradhara.
Sorry, they're amongst the disciples, did you say? Oh.
Yes, like people who, in front of, I don't know. That is what my question is. Like
that Sutrayana Buddhas are below them, you're saying?
4 rows of tantric deities and Sutrayana Buddhas.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay.
And also,
so, I don't think it's saying that they're the disciples.
Sorry.
Right. So, for example, if we have the Lama Chupa merit field, you know this because this is the simplest one to talk about. You know what I'm talking about in the Guru Puja, the Lama Chupa merit field.
Yeah.
It has Lama Tsongkhapa in the center, and then underneath that it has all these rows of deities. So it's not necessarily saying Tsongkhapa is higher than them. The point here is it's within that gradation from the highest Yoga Tantra down to the bottom, the protectors, there is some gradation, but it's not saying that then the central figure is higher than them. It's more understood these are emanations of the central figure. So each class within the Lama Chupa merit field, you have Lama Tsongkhapa in the center with Guru Shakyamuni at his heart and then Vajradhara at his heart. Then you have above him the lineage, the 5 lineages of the 5 tantric lineages. And then to the right and left, you have the lineages of historical people, Indian and Tibetan masters. And then below him, you have the gradation of all the deities and so forth. So those are sort of different. It's not like the lineage is at the top and then the deities at the bottom because the lineage is higher per se. It's more that they're in different places in the picture, but they're all understood to be, I guess you could say that the lineage at the top is what is feeding into Tsongkhapa, because you see the light rays coming out of them and going into his heart. So it's like he's an emanation of that lineage. And then all of these deities are his emanation. But of course, in terms of hierarchy, ultimately there's no hierarchy. They're all enlightened beings. So it's not like one is more enlightened than the other, but it has to do with the appearance to our mind and which one we should take as, because we have I just mentioned the vows of individual liberation, then bodhisattva vows, then tantric vows. So we consider the tantric vows the higher vows, such that if something contravenes one or the other, you should you should follow the tantric vow. You should follow the tantric vow and break the patimoksha vow if you have to. You shouldn't break the tantric vow to keep the patimoksha vow. So that's why the tantric deities are above the sutra deities, and the bodhisattvas are above the hearers, because that's the bodhisattva vows. And then within tantra, you have the gradation that the highest yoga tantra is the most advanced, so that's highest. But yeah, it's understood for our own minds. But from the side of the teachers, in the picture, it's actually understood. It's all one day. It's all one mind. That these are all emanations of Tsongkhapa's mind. So, and that Tsongkhapa himself is an emanation of Guru Shakyamuni, who is an emanation of Vajradhara. So it's not like there's all these different separate minds. I mean, this also becomes a question about the Buddhas. Are they all different minds, or is it one mind? But this isn't exactly the question here, because here it's really talking about one field of Buddhas, right? So for example, if I become Buddha and you become Buddha, then at least in the Gelug system, we'd say there's different continuums of mind. But if I become Buddha and appear as the 32 deities of the Guhya Samaja system, that's all emanations of one mind, because it's one person who became enlightened in that system. So likewise in the Lama Chöpa merit field, it's all emanations of Tsongkhapa's mind.
So, but actually, what is the real difference between merit field and refuge field?
There isn't a difference. This is different than translation.
Okay.
I mean, Sokshing in Tibetan, so merit field. I've never seen the word Kapshing, which would be refuge field, but it's understood that you go to merit, you go for refuge to this field, right? But it's usually referred, in Tibetan, it's referred to as Sokshing, which is merit field.
Mm-hmm. And there is I mean, I have heard this say, that, I mean, I have doubt about to a direct perceiver. I mean, can I perceive the impermanence of a pot? Not gross, but subtle impermanence. I mean, not a yogic direct perceiver,
okay.
but a normal perceiver.
Well, we'd say that it appears, but it's not ascertained, right? So if you have the sevenfold classification of minds and awareness, right? You have direct perceivers, and then inferential cognizers, and subsequent cognizers, and so forth. So the sixth one, a mind to which an object appears but is not ascertained, right?
Yeah.
So your eye consciousness perceiving a pot is a direct, valid perceiver in general, but with regard to the impermanence of pot, it's an awareness to which something appears but is not ascertained. So the impermanence of pot appears to your eye consciousness, but you don't ascertain it, which is quite practical. We can understand that, of course, every moment as the pot changes, it's appearing to your eyes. It's not like if the pot is disintegrating moment by moment, then the previous moment can't appear to your consciousness in the second moment. But it doesn't, you don't ascertain it in that you don't see it changing. You don't recognize that it's changing moment to moment. I mean, you could conceptually understand it, but it doesn't mean that to your eyes, it doesn't appear any different. It appears as a static thing.
So do you mean
appears,
to
I mean, I'm saying it.
Yeah. It means that we don't perceive it or we don't remember it. What is it? I mean,
well, so perceive is a funny word. I don't know how we, because it's not really clear what that should mean. You know, you don't ascertain it, right? But it does appear, right? So I realized I just said that it appears as static to you. So I have to qualify that because, okay, there's different in the Sautantrika system. It doesn't appear static. I shouldn't have said that. It appears changing, but you don't apprehend that. You don't ascertain that, and then you think that it's static. You have the conception of it as static. Whereas actually in the Madhyamaka system, it does appear as static. It appears both as static and changing. Both appearances are there at the same time. Because based on your habituation to it being static, it appears as static, even though it's not. But based on its actual nature of being changing, it appears as changing. Both appearances are there.
Okay. I mean, I'm not sure that I am able to understand the difference, but I will chew on it. Maybe some other day I will understand it. But it's
well, you can just think that like appearance just means what's happening without beyond your awareness necessarily, right? So all these things are appearing to your consciousness or to your eyes all the time that you don't necessarily ascertain. You know, all the subtle things, you know, all the different, you'd say that all these different little waves of light are hitting your eyes, but you don't necessarily recognize them. So that's what appear would mean here. Whereas ascertain means that you're able to say, yeah, I saw that.
Okay, so when I look at the pot, I know that pot, that is ascertain. I can ascertain that pot. But impermanence of the pot, I cannot ascertain.
Right, you can't, with your eye consciousness, you cannot ascertain it. Yeah.
Only with some knowledge that the pot must be changing momentarily.
You can use inference to recognize it must be changing for this and this reason.
Okay, and there is one more question about the book that you had suggested by this Denma Locho Rinpoche, Meditative States in Tibetan Buddhism. Now, I'm not very so much deep into Buddhism. I mean, I have been trying to meditate and all that, but will this be useful for me at this stage? Or, I mean, I don't know how you will answer this.
Well, I guess I'm not sure what level you're at exactly. That book is probably quite technical. It's not going to be something you can read that book and then meditate on it, because that book is talking first about achieving calm abiding, which is a very advanced state, and then about the different dhyanas, the concentrations that you can achieve from that, which is extremely advanced. No, I don't know anyone who claims to have those states.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, it's more for gaining an understanding, you know, of what is meditation about. But for your personal practice, it might help to get an idea, sort of a conceptual framework of what meditation is. But it's not, you know, for your day-to-day meditation, it wouldn't be like a book. Okay, pick up an instruction manual on meditation.
Okay. There is one more book about which I wanted to ask you. That is, actually, I mean, it's not that I haven't taken all those tantric initiations and all that, but there is a book called Manjushri's Innermost Secret, a profound commentary on oral instructions on the practice of Lama Chopa by Dechen Ling Practice Series. Now, I just attained Lama Chopa online when in some institution they do the Lama Chopa online. Beyond that, I don't have any acquaintance with that. nor do I have any initiation. So what happened to Venerable Shantiji?
Connection problem. He'll be back.
There he is. Yeah.
Sorry, you said there was one more book about, and they didn't get anything after that.
Okay. There is this book called Manjushri's Innermost Secret, a profound commentary of oral instructions on the practice of Lama Chopa by Kachen Yeshe Gyaltsen. So what I wanted to ask you was, I have not received any initiation regarding Lama Chopa. So will that book be proper for me?
Okay.
Apart from attending some online Lama Chopa, I have no connection with Lama Chopa. So these
have you
books
received
are,
the highest Yoga Tantra empowerment?
No. Apart from, I mean, only one, because I'm a little confused. I didn't really get to, get any chance to ask this question. About 3 years ago, His Holiness had given those mass initiation at Bodh Gaya, and that was
The Kala Chakra,
no, that was not Kala Chakra. It was Vajra Bhairava.
The Manjushri.
Manjushri, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
So since that day, I mean, there were some nuns there. I mean, they were guiding us, and even Venerable Tenzin Gache was there, and he had given some lectures about what to expect and a sort of guidance about the initiation. So since that day, I have been doing 6-session Guru Yoga twice a day, and also Guru Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga. So I don't know what it is, frankly speaking. I have been doing it without really understanding whether it was, what kind of initiation it was and all that. So I don't know. Can you please guide me about it?
Well, I mean, basically, so you took the empowerment and you've been doing the commitments.
Yes.
So you're authorized to read the book. I mean, you haven't been doing the Lama Chopa practice, it sounds like, daily.
No.
So you technically would be authorized to read it, although it might not be so useful for you, but if you're not doing the Lama Chopa practice, because it's very technical about the visualization and so forth within Lama Chopa. I mean, you can read it, but if you're doing 6-session Guru Yoga, it probably makes more sense to read about that. And the idea is that, I mean, these are very advanced practices anyway. And so taking the empowerment and doing the commitments on a daily basis is a good way to make a connection with the practice. But, you shouldn't consider this as this is my main practice. The main practice, it's sort of good to work with the fundamentals first. So, I mean, you can read the book, to get some kind of imprint if you want, but it wouldn't be the main focus. I mean, it's more important to focus on the basics of the path. So on, the Mahayana path with compassion, and then in terms of renunciation, it's very important to understand about these things. Sometimes it's not emphasized as much because we talk about Mahayana, but it's very important to understand the fundamentals of the Buddha's teachings on renunciation and on the Four Noble Truths, especially, and then on emptiness to get start getting into that. Otherwise, with the highest Yoga Tantra things, I mean, this is a thing. It's hard to say. I don't know what it was like exactly in Tibet in the old days, but from what I understand, for example, at Sera, my monastery, which was in Tibet before. Monks were not allowed to take empowerments while they were studying until they became Geshes. That changed mainly in the 1960s, it sounds like, when Dzongchen Rinpoche gave empowerments to the monks at Boksa, the refugee settlement, basically with the intention that this lineage is dying out, and so people have to get some kind of imprint. And now that's become very common in the West. So I don't know how it was in Tibet. I think maybe it was the same for lay people in Tibet, that they would take these empowerments trying to kind of get some kind of imprint. But their relation to Buddhism was very different than people in the West now, because a lot of the lay people in Tibet it was really just a matter of getting an imprint. They didn't really do much practice or study. They recited these things every day, but they didn't know what they were reciting very well, and that was considered okay. Whereas in the West, most people, they're approaching it very differently. They think about what they're doing and want to know about it. They're very educated usually. I say West, I mean in India, I should in the West, but I guess we'd say out in the places where really what the difference is places that have a modern education. This is very different from places in Tibet. So in that sense, India, USA, it doesn't make that much of a difference in that regard. So the way people are approaching it is very different.
Yes.
So this thing of, it's become, I mean, I just know from when I was a young person in America before I ordained, it was like, this is the big thing to get empowerment. So when you start getting empowerments, you kind of just take more and more empowerments and forget about all these other things because that's so inconsequential. This is the higher practice. Tantric vows are so much more important. So why is it so important to worry about these little things like renunciation? So I think this is a bit of a misunderstanding that can come up, that people who take tantric empowerment and recite mantras on a daily basis aren't necessarily tantric practitioners. I mean, in some sense they are inspiring to do this, but that's not, it's like, to really actually be doing the practice that it's just impossible that somebody could be doing that, unless they have these spectacular imprints from a previous lifetime. And so really, so even now today at Sera, we do receive empowerment. It's changed now, but nobody, for the most part, does these practices regularly. They might recite the commitments, but there's not like the monks, meditate on the 6 yogas of Naropa or something like that on a daily basis. Maybe a few of them who are very special to do that in secret, but generally speaking, the main focus is on the sutra studies. And then once people get to a very advanced level of that, then they start doing tantric practices in a real way, where it's really not just a matter of reciting something, but actually engaging in the practice. So, if you've taken the commitment, of course, it's good. You should do the 6 session guru yoga every day.
Yeah.
But it's not that, you have to think that therefore I'm doing that, so all my energy should go into reading about 6 session guru yoga and doing the visualization all perfectly. It's more about making an imprint and making an aspiration that every day I aspire that I'm going to study the Hinayana path, but I'm not just going to achieve that result. I want to eventually, flourish and grow to the point where I can, integrate the tantric practices as well.
Yes. Actually, I'm happy with these things that I'm doing, like doing the 6 session Guru Yoga and Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga. That is all. And I haven't been reading too many books of this higher level. Actually, I'm doing this Dudra course, debate and logic and debate course. So, and of course, trying to, understand 4 noble truths and all these basic ideas. But because these books I saw, I thought, and talking about imprints, I wanted to ask you one question. In your lecture series on 60 stanzas, I think you mentioned that there were 2, I don't remember the names of those Western, 19th century Western scholars, but you had discussed them, not Niji, was it Niji and who else? One more person.
Nietzsche and Schopenhauer.
Yeah, Schopenhauer. But they were great thinkers, scholars, and it looks like they were slightly acquainted with Buddhism, but they kind of not really, I mean, I can't say they failed, but they did not really go ahead much with their scholarship and the knowledge that they had acquired. So what must be the reason for this? Is it that they didn't have connection with a proper guru, or they didn't have the imprints, or what was it? And secondly, I completely agree with you that in India, we are Western, I mean, we are educated in through the Western education system. So we are just like Westerners in that sense. So we have just that kind of, we have lost our own traditions, frankly speaking, Indian philosophy and all that. We don't have, nobody knows what Sankhya is, and nobody knows what Mimamsa is and Vaishashika is. Nobody knows now. So it is like we have become also Westerners. So my question is that, do we need to have those imprints or what?
Or do we need to have imprints to practice, you're saying? So, okay, so a few things. In terms of those philosophers, I guess when I brought them up in terms of the 60 stanzas, or also in the 70 stanzas course, I actually also talked about it. I had quoted that. I used a quote from 6 stanzas, but then talked about them. And my point there was, the quote was saying that people who just engage in mere scholarship without creating merit. So of course, I think there's a lot of things they did wrong. I don't want to be too harsh on them. But I think, it's not like they didn't do anything right either. It's not like you can blame everybody. But my point is that I think they had some understanding of emptiness, and they had, and they had some exposure to Buddhism. Now, I'm not sure that actually were related, because I don't think, for example, in Nietzsche's case, I know more about Nietzsche than I know about Schopenhauer. I think, his exposure to Buddhism was very basic, and was more, Theravada Buddhism. I don't know if he really knew about teachings at emptiness. I doubt he knew anything about Nagarjuna. But I think his philosophy in general incorporated some aspects of an understanding of emptiness. Not that it was like perfect understanding, but at least in terms of understanding that, the way that our minds construct our experience, and then we therefore forget that and think that it's coming from the side of the object. I think he had actually a very acute understanding in some level of that. And so in that sense, he wasn't totally wrong. He actually had some very powerful insights. But the problem was, in Nietzsche's case, that's why I think it's a very good example of not creating merit, that he didn't have any way to bring that into practice. So even in a conventional sense, not just talking about Buddhism and creating merit, but in terms of stabilizing the mind. So actually, Carl Jung, you probably know the German psychologist. He actually knew a lot. He studied Nietzsche very extensively, and he quoted from him and was a great admirer of a lot of his work. But he felt that Nietzsche also made a lot of mistakes personally, and he compared himself to Nietzsche in that regard. Carl Jung, in his early life, or midlife, I'd say, late 30s, early 40s, and about I think it was a period 1913 to 1919, they say. He spent a lot of time in private meditation, and had some very deep experiences that could have destabilized him. And he thinks that because he was married and had children and was working a regular job, that it kept him in balance, and he didn't just go crazy. Whereas he thinks that Nietzsche did a very similar thing, but at that point Nietzsche was unemployed because he was no longer working at the university, and he was unmarried, and also physically quite ill. And so he really just drove himself crazy, because he didn't have anything to stabilize his mind as he went through these experiences. So, from a Buddhist perspective, we'd say it's a similar idea, that you have to be married or have a job per se, but you have to have something. It's not just you just think and think and think and think. You sometimes have to take a break and do something more mundane with your mind that also that stabilizes it, and accumulating merit, doing things like prostrations and mantra recitation, where or just thinking about compassion, that it's not so much in your head all the time. It helps to and it also creates something positive. It's better to do prostrations than probably to have a family per se. Family can be very positive, but it's a very mixed situation where there's sometimes anger, sometimes attachment, all these things. But the point is that you're doing something to generate positive emotions in the mind, such that you're not just always trying to focus on the final meaning of things. So that was my example of these people, that they use that, that wisdom, but they don't temper it. They don't have any way to balance, keep it in balance. Otherwise, it can be dangerous. So, yeah, and I mean, I guess there's a few other things I was going to say that I can't quite remember. I got off track, but in terms of your question about modernity in India, I think that's why I said I shouldn't be called Western education, because a lot of the ideas that are taught, of course, it's very heavily Western biased, but it's universal in a lot of ways too. There's a lot of, it's not necessarily bad. I mean, as I say, I think it's something that is very useful that it was in Tibet was lacking. But as you say, it's sort of, we'd say since the Enlightenment in Europe is really when these ideas have started to spread, and there's a very heavy bias towards a certain kind of thinking that excludes spiritual understanding. In terms of materialism, especially in terms of thinking that everything that exists has to be materially based. But also that it has to be understood through a rational perspective. It's understood that if something is basically the opposite of the word rational, irrational. So it implies that anything that's not understood through reason is therefore unreasonable, and that there's no other way to understand something. So it's like either you're using reason, or you're just completely random and not just ignorant. But in India there was a very strong understanding of other kinds of awareness, which both is beyond ordinary reason for one thing, and secondly is beyond materialism. So yeah, I think that's perhaps the issue, is that it's not that it's a very good thing that India or other cultures have adopted the modern education, not because they should become like the West, but because simply that the idea of having universal education where people learn to think is really useful for everybody. Yes. But if it then goes to the extreme of blocking out traditions that are actually very useful, that's the danger. Was there anything else that I missed, perhaps, that you remember from your question?
No, it was more or less in this context. And to add, if I may add, I studied Sartre and Camus, and Sartre's approach comes very close to this renunciation, and then he talks about a kind of nausea of the world, and then he says that everything is attacking my consciousness. I mean, even a stone and everything around him. So when I studied those things, I wasn't introduced to Buddhism. I mean, I didn't know anything about Buddhism at all. So that was way back. And then I felt at that time that he had almost come to the edge of something very nice, and then he didn't get any further than that. That was my feeling at that time. And much later, after maybe 30 years or something, when I learned about the lack of self, believing in the self and non-existent self and all that, then I sort of thought that it was something like that he was believing in, and then that happened, some alienation from the society, and because he always talks about extreme alienation from the society, both Camus and Sartre, both of them. So this is where you, I mean, even if you help some people, it's possible that you are creating merit apart from other things. So generating merit seems to be a very important thing by helping others, at least.
Yeah, well, of course. And as I said, that merit, we shouldn't think that merit is only a property of Buddhists, that, other people, obviously ordinary people who help people are creating merit, and sometimes they're creating a lot more merit than some people who consider themselves as Buddhist and are doing all these practices.
Yes.
It depends on the person's mind.
Yes.
You know, in terms of these philosophers that you mentioned, because they're very much in the Nietzschean tradition, we'd say continental philosophy, which is kind of distinct from, we'd say, analytical philosophy. There's the two main distinctions of Western philosophy. You know, it seems like, you know, to me, it's sort of a bit of a generalization, but I think it's helpful to think about it, that a lot of these people recognize the first two noble truths, but they didn't recognize the latter two noble truths.
Yes.
That they really recognize that everything is dissatisfactory, but they didn't recognize there's some other option. So therefore, the only thing to do is just, you know, either be miserable about it or find a way to just make the best of it, which seems to be Camus' approach. That he said, you know, you just, as long as you're aware of the absurd every day, you can just continue to live your life and do the best you can. You know, the traditional analogy is like smoking a cigarette, that, you know, if you know the cigarette's going to eventually be finished, some people might panic, oh, the cigarette's going to finish, and some people just enjoy the cigarette. So this is their approach to life.
Yes.
You know, so there's something kind of, you know, say, poetic about it, and it's actually quite useful because it can help our practice, I think, to think, because these people had a lot more insight into Western society than ancient Buddhists, because ancient Buddhists didn't live in Western society. So it can help our thinking, you know, and it can challenge. I mean, certainly they had said some very challenging things. But then the question is, you know, so because I think in a lot of them also, it's sort of taken for granted that the mind ceases at death, and that anyone who thinks otherwise is just being a fantasy, you know, idealistic. Which, you know, there's a question. It's like, because again, it's this question of, okay, if you're looking at, for example, in Nietzsche's case, you know, Nietzsche lived among a lot of people who he felt were in denial, and I think maybe he was right, that they believed that when they died, they were all going to heaven. And he thought this was just a way of escaping the truth of suffering. Whereas, you know, so is that the only other option? Is it that you either are in this fantasy world of I'm not going to die, or nothing, you know, everything's good and everyone, the universe is all loving and there's no problems, you know, or is there actually something deeper? Because Buddhism says there's something deeper, but it doesn't say it's easy. It doesn't say there's, oh yeah, don't worry about suffering because you can just have liberation. It says, if you really want to be free, there's another path. But as you remember, at the end of the 60 stanzas course, if you happen to watch that, on the very last, the end, I said, this is a narrow path. It's very few people find this. This is actually a quote from the Bible, but I think it's very nice that it's not like universal salvation per se. I mean, ultimately it is, but in the short run, you know, it's very, very hard to get beyond this. But the purpose here is that, you know, to just start generating faith that there is something, and to, you know, have, it's like the faith has to continually be sort of, what's the word? Like, what's the word? Like, you have to keep kind of skinning away the wrong layers. Like, if we don't have false faith, so it has to, so it's good maybe to read the existentialist, you know, challenging that, you know, so we don't get too idealistic, thinking, oh, everything is going to be okay because I have faith in Buddha. You know, keep being challenged again and again, but so that the false faith that's sort of too idealistic, thinking that I'm not suffering, gets you know, sort of pushed away, and then you can get to something that's actually real, that there's actually something worth having faith in.
Yes. I think it's pretty late, but I have to ask you one small question,
Okay.
a very mundane question, actually. Now, there are people who are constantly aware of their suffering, and there are people who seem to be very happy. So naturally, the question arises as to, if they are not aware of their suffering, then why go through all these hardships and follow the path, because Buddhism is difficult. I mean, it is like it is difficult to understand, to take vows, to follow the things. Like, it's a disciplined life.
Mm-hmm.
And though it has
Mm-hmm.
its joyous effort and all that, but still there are moments when you really feel very exhausted by the thought of, doing all that. And then you look around, especially when I look around, I find that there are people who are so happy without doing any of these things. So how do I reconcile with that?
Well, like Shantideva said, what is it? Derar shindu dunga war rongdu mitong gangyampa dambo nini seche ne ngenson mise namsu tong. So he said, it's sort of maybe a bit gross, but it says, all these people who, although they're in this severe crisis of suffering, don't see it that way. First, they'll be killed and then they'll burn in hell. It's a bit extreme. But the point he's meaning is that ordinary happiness is actually very deceptive. That, so we see people in the world who look very happy. And it's not saying they're not happy, but the question is that going to last forever, for one thing? And secondly, how deeply does that go? And it's not, burn in hell is a bit loaded word because it's like, oh, they're going to be punished. This isn't the idea. But that, these states don't last forever. So this is what we really have to use analysis and think about these things. This is very good because it's showing if we still think this person looks happy and that looks like a desirable thing to have, that shows that we haven't really internalized renunciation, that we haven't really understood the truth of suffering. If you watched somebody, if you zoomed out of a picture and you see somebody, walking along joyously who's about to fall off a cliff, they don't realize they're about to walk off a cliff, you wouldn't think I'd like to have their position. But it could be the same with ordinary people we see who have happiness. Now, the happiness they have is, we'd say, the result of karma. It's the result of positive karma from the past. So that's something to rejoice in. And it's not to say that we should just, think, oh, this person is there's nothing to learn from this. Some people might be very happy because they're very kind and it makes them happy. So we shouldn't think that's a bad thing. But is that enough? So, for example, some people might think, who have some understanding of psychology, this is the ideal state, is to be a nice person and have a nice life. It's better not to be religious because being religious, causes all these wrong views people have. But you can just be a good person and give a lot and be kind with the people around you, be very patient, and you'll be really happy as best as you can. It's not saying that's bad. It's not saying, well, no, you should just be a mean person. But the point is that Buddhism is questioning, is that enough? Is that really going to bring you a long-term result that's worthwhile? And this is a difficult question. We have to really question that because it's basically saying it's not, that it's good even in the night X life, it's going to benefit that person, but that person still has seeds of negative karma in their mind, and when they meet with the right circumstances, those will ripen. So even in this life, we could say some person, might be really nice and kind, but they have some awful tragedy in their life and they can't cope with it. Or somebody could be really nice and kind, but they meet a teacher who's part of a cult and they join the cult, and then they get convinced to do all these terrible things. And that might not happen in this life, but as long as the potential is there, then, according to Buddha's teachings, it will definitely happen eventually. If they don't meet with the teacher who can teach them to go deeper, eventually that positive state will wear off, because the positive state is the suffering of change. Ordinary happy states are what we call the suffering of change. They're not the suffering of suffering because they're not manifest suffering, but they're the suffering of change because, one, they will change to suffering if they go on long enough, and secondly, because they will elicit suffering. You know, by our attachment to them, it will actually create the causes for suffering in the future. And so we have to think about these points again and again.
Yes.
And it's very good that you're aware of that, because it's good not to just think, oh, I don't care. You know, some people, they get, okay, all these people in the world, they're all suffering. I don't care about all of that. It's good to recognize, actually, to my mind, this appears like happiness. And then to really think about that. You know, what's appearing to your mind.
I'm still struggling with the first noble truth after all this.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's after all
suffering.
this. I mean, I think anybody here would admit, you're in the monastery, that their entire life they're still struggling with the first noble truth, except for maybe 2 or 3 of them. They wouldn't say it, but they say there's 2 or 3 people in this monastery who are beyond that, but the rest of them are still struggling with it.
Thank you, Venerable.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So we'd say I have a couple more minutes if someone has a last minute question. Yeah, okay.
Okay, I just a yes/no answer. Did you say that eye consciousness, apprehending part, the appearing object, the impermanence of part, did you say that eye consciousness is an inattentive awareness in respect to the impermanence of part?
To the impermanence of part.
Yeah.
Yes. But the eye consciousness itself is not an attentive awareness, right?
The eye consciousness apprehending part is not
Yes.
an inattentive awareness in respect to part.
Right.
Eye consciousness apprehending part, let's say the appearing object impermanence of part.
Mm-hmm.
So if you posit eye consciousness apprehending impermanence of part, then that's an inattentive awareness.
Well, there's no such thing as an eye consciousness apprehending impermanence of part per se, except in an Arya being, right? But if you have, so you have the eye consciousness apprehending part, and to the impermanence of part, it is an inattentive awareness.
Okay.
But it is not an inattentive awareness.
Okay. Okay.
Right?
Okay. Second one is just a quick point. Yeah, on my notes I sent over, I posit the blue square is not blue, and for some reason you've answered probably true.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about the square blue. Well, I wonder if you could talk about the horse white. That's my thought.
Well, it's a little different because
really?
a horse is a person, right? I mean, we wouldn't say it in colloquial, but right, it's a person in Buddhist philosophy. It's a being, living being. So the white is a quality that it possesses, right? So then you have color and shape are both aspects of visual consciousness, right? So if you say the blue square, really you're saying that there's a shape that has a color, right?
Yeah.
But you could just as well talk about a color that has a shape. You see blue, and it's in the form of a square, right? But you couldn't talk about. You can talk about a horse that has a color, but you can't talk about a color that has a horse. It doesn't make any sense because a horse is not a quality that something possesses in that sense, right? But in terms of eye consciousness, if I see something, there's both shape and color appearing to my eyes. So I can focus on the shape, I can focus on the color, but you wouldn't say one is predominant, except whatever I focus on. So to say that it's a blue square just depends on how you frame it. I think of it as a blue square, or I think of it as a square blue. I mean, in English, it sounds a bit funny, but you say a square patch of blue, you might say.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to go for that one. I don't know if we'd say that, would we? And then on a little bit more of a serious note, when we talk about same entity, just proving that two phenomena are the same entity, I use the example of, well, we can say it's a generality in instance. And thank you for your answer. I think, just pull it up here. What did you put there? That actually we're taking the, we're positing the thing to be proved as the proof.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and I get that. So would you say that, because I often hear that, I understand the pervasion with same entity and being related as same entity.
That was it, Shanti. You just had it just now. Shanti, what you just were showing was that.
So it was
right. So if I ask you, I was talking to Shanti, she had it on the screen, below a bit, go down a bit, and it'll be there. Yeah, here, right here at the bottom of the screen here. So positing the thing to be proved is the proof, right? So if I say to you, if you didn't know that that gold pot is one nature with pot,
yes,
right? And I tried to prove it to you. Well, yes, gold nature is one nature with pot because it's an instant of pot. It would be impossible for you to know that if you didn't know that it's it's one nature with pot.
Yeah.
So it couldn't be that you already know it's an instance, and therefore I say to you, well, you know it's an instance, right? So therefore you can infer that it's a one nature with pot.
Yeah.
Because in order to know it's an instance of pot, you have to already have known that it's one nature with pot.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's logical. Yeah, and that's good. Thank you for that. Would you ever go? Okay, if someone was asking, is the pot and the color of the pot same entity?
Yeah.
Would you say that they are related as same entity? Because if they're different, and if the pot doesn't exist, then the shape of the pot doesn't exist.
Well, the pot is one nature or one entity with the color.
Sorry,
color is one entity with the pot. Yeah. The color is related to the pot as one entity. The pot is not related to the color as one entity. That's the distinction.
Well, I would say if the color of the pot doesn't exist, by the power of the color of the pot being reversed, then the pot is reversed.
Well, the problem is that
it's a blue pot.
the pot appears. The pot appears to your set tactile consciousness, but the color doesn't. So the pot can appear without the color. So it's not related to it, because if it was related to it, wherever one appeared, the other would have to appear.
Okay.
Right. So wherever the pot exists, yeah.
No, please finish.
Well, yeah, that the pot, whatever the pot appears to, the thing doesn't have to appear to. So if something is related to something as what entity, then when when the thing that's related appears, the thing that's related to has to also appear to direct perception.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So, okay, so that was our goal. That was but it's not incorrect to say that if it isn't an instance of pot, then it's necessarily the same entity as pot. I mean, I think that's fairly okay. And pot pervades all instances.
It's true. It's
but it's not the.
Yeah, it's true. If something is an instance of pot, it's necessarily one nature with pot.
Yeah.
However, if I was to say, what does it mean to be one nature with pot? And I said, well, it could be that it's an instant of pot.
Yeah.
It doesn't say anything new.
No.
right?
And
Like,
I understand
right.
that.
So it's not just
the
that it can't be used as a proof, but if you make a list of the different ways something could be one entity, that
Yeah.
can't be one of the reasons, because then it begs the question of, well, what does that mean?
Yes. And
Right.
the three criteria, the first criteria, it is same entity. Yeah. If it's an instant.
Right. Yeah, the three criteria.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and pot pervades all over it. Pot pervades all instances of pot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pot, yeah.
Well, yeah, basically, but there's a question of
so,
yeah. But then you have this thing of the pot that's the cause of a pot. This is a funny subject, right?
Well, I had another.
The cause of a pot is a pot, but it's not an instance of pot, and it's not one nature with a pot.
Well, I've got a question I want to put to you. Okay, so it's a little bit of a loaded question. Yeah. So, if pot pervades all instances of pot, would
yeah.
Okay. So it follows that golden pot. It follows that golden pot pervades all instances of pot.
Why?
Because golden pot is pot, and pot pervades over all instances of pot.
No pervasion.
Well, it has to be pervasion. If pot pervades over all instances of pot,
okay.
So, and golden pot is pot.
Right.
It follows that golden pot pervades over all instances of pot.
Well, then it follows that pot pervades over all instances of object of knowledge, because pot is object of knowledge. Why should something being pot mean that it pervades wherever pot it pervades?
Well, if we say that pot pervades over all instances of pot,
mm-hmm.
and gold pot is pot,
right,
then surely gold pot pervades over all instances of pot.
Well, again, so objective knowledge pervades over all instances of objective knowledge. And pot is objective knowledge. Does that mean that pot pervades all instances of objective knowledge?
Okay. Sorry, it was just something that came, something that came up when I was reading your notes.
Okay.
Sorry. It's just a pleasure just to be able to ask you. That's all. It's just, I was just curious. Thank you. I don't just want before we all go. I just want to say thank you. It's been really enjoyable to tune in, and I hope in the future when the when the BP is finished for another year, then I'm hoping you'll be teaching, and I can come and listen into your talks. And if you could ever give a talk on subtle impermanence, on how to meditate on that, how to understand that if it's created and its causes have ceased, so it has to be disintegrating, otherwise that would be contradictory with a thing. If you could ever give a talk on that, because I see here that subtle impermanence is pushed in the Gelugpa tradition. I see it in the books and the talks we have here, focus on subtle impermanence, but we don't seem to be, or certainly in my experience, we don't seem to have the teachings on subtle impermanence. I mean, we go through the small topics, we debate it, and we can get this kind of understanding, but to have an actual teaching on subtle impermanence, it seems to me quite rare. Advertisement. Geshe Graham has done a very good job in this book that he's put together.
We have that.
And I studied that for quite some time, and of course discussed it with Geshe. But if you're inclined and you have had time to give a teaching on some talks on subtle impermanence, I would. I think there's a few of us here who'd be quite interested to join in.
Okay, let's see. I'll just say that in the first chapter of Dhammakirti's text, in the section on dayu, which means the object of terminology, that's where it actually gets clarified the best. I don't think that's even translated in English, though. So, I mean, not just the verse, because the verse, actually, I don't even think it's in the verse. It's in Gyaltsen Pa's commentary that he talks about it, based on something said in the verse. That's when we talk about this. It's actually really hard, even though it's something that we studied in the first year. This was an interesting experience I had when I had the opportunity to debate the Lhasa Rinpoche Geshes as they were becoming Geshe.
Mm-hmm.
And I debated this point, and they didn't know how to answer it.
Okay.
And we were debating. We came all the way back to collected topics, and we were debating from that, and they were stuck. So it's actually kind of difficult to posit some of these things. But I'd be interested to talk about it. So just maybe remind me later. Yeah, bring this up again, and we could talk about this. Yeah,
and just how to. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time, but just even how to identify. I mean, I spent 3 or 4 months kind of frying my brain on this, meditating, studying, and I probably gave myself a bit of a headache, if the truth is known. But just to identify that grasping at permanence, that seemed quite that seemed quite difficult. It wasn't. It's not so. It wasn't so obvious. And then when you had the experience of, I use the Nāgārjuna apple tree. So the Nāgārjuna apple tree of winter, is the Nāgārjuna apple tree of summer is the effect of the Nāgārjuna apple tree of winter. So, can't exist at the same time. So you say, there's cause and effect. And then somebody comes along and says, well, there is something which is there, in summer and winter, and that's the Nāgārjuna apple tree. And then somehow, you come to this kind of conclusion that you are actually grasping at something, that's, the leaves and the branches, they might be changing, but still you're holding on to something, some kind of essence that is unchanging. And if you have any advice and kind of, because I found that was quite a moment to just see that you're actually, you are holding on to this kind of unchanging essence. It's easy, it's not easy, but you can debate it and try to understand the logic. But to try to cultivate that mind that you can see that, yes, I am grasping at something unchanging there. Then that seemed to be quite difficult. Harder than the logic.
Recognizing it.
Harder than the logic.
Well, it's the same with the meditation and emptiness. The Tsongkhapa says that there's the logic, but that can only be applied once you recognize the way that your mind is grasping at it, and that's the hardest part.
Okay.
Yeah. So we can. I'll be happy to just remind me, and we can talk about these things in the future. So just to recapitulate what I said at the beginning. I don't know if everyone was here. I think only 3 of you were there at the beginning, but so we have our exams maybe next month, so I'll probably take a break from doing these kind of sessions for the time being. And also, it's really kind of concerning, the outbreak at Sera. As I said at the beginning of the session, we just had 12 cases today. I expect we're going to have a lot more because these were all over the place in many different parts of the monastery. I just don't know how things are going to pan out here. If we're lucky, we can stay healthy. But even regarding not, being sick, I just don't know about what's going to happen in the monastery, how it's going to continue to function. So it's difficult. It's a hard time for the Tibetan settlements and for the monasteries. If things go well and we have the exams, then in November I'll have more time, so we can do maybe more of these sessions, or as I hope to teach maybe, as I mentioned before, a couple of other of Nagarjuna's works, the is it Grinding to Dust, and then the Precious Garland, And maybe if people have it, want to let me know which one they'd, don't say it right now, but we can have like a list and people saying which one they prefer if I only had time to do one. And then I would hope to maybe teach some time on Dharmakirti, because we'll be studying Dharmakirti in November, December time, maybe January. Let's see. And then, yeah, it's been very nice to be teaching for Root Institute, which I really like supporting Root Institute. And
thank you, Venerable, very much from Root Institute.
So maybe, yeah, as the time goes on in the future years, it's really nice to be able to teach these Indian texts, which we don't always study directly. So next year we study Vinaya, which is a very different thing. We've now finished 14 years of philosophical studies, and then we take a totally different path and study about the discipline. So it'll be very different. And I wonder, it'd be interesting to see. I don't know if teaching on Vinaya would be more for monks and nuns, but we'll see if there's something relevant that I could, do in this kind of online forum, because it's helpful. And I expect we're going to still be in lockdown next year, so I'll have time for these kind of things if we're still okay here. So let's just see how it all goes. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much
yeah.
to all of you, and to Venerable, and to all my team in Root Institute. Thank you for your donations, and see you at our other programs.
Okay.
Thank you, Shanti.
Thank you.
Thank you, Venerable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Good night.
Thank you, Shanti.